So the question of the day is, should you buy a 4th generation 4Runner 2003-2009? Is it a good truck? It was a good truck when it came out and has great reviews, but how is it holding up as time passes by? Today's video, I'm going to share with you some of the common problems you can expect with these trucks as of the date of filming this video. And if you're going to buy one or if you own one, what are some of the things that are so common with these? I would actually check them. But before we get started, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. If you are a returning subscriber, well, thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. And without further ado, let's go check this thing out. So starting with the engine, there's two possible engines for this truck. There's the 4-liter V6 1GRFE, the old style one, not the newer one in the newer 4Runner. And then there is the 4.7-liter beloved V8. I love that engine so much. I wish they still make it, but emissions and all that stuff. Anyhow, let's start with the V6. So the first issues with the V6. You have a common front timing cover leak. Again, we've been through this with other models. This is super common on these, and you'll see it right on top of the power steering pump. You'll see oil all over the place. That is common with these. It's actually not extremely difficult to replace it, to reseal that front timing cover, unlike the newer ones where you have to disassemble a lot more to do it. That was something somewhat common on these. I would definitely check, and it's super simple to check. You just open the hood, look right on top of the power steering pump area. You'll see a lot of oil, and that's your indication that the front timing cover is leaking. Another thing that is very common and somewhat simple to do on these is the idler. The idler pulleys, there's a few of them, and they're notorious to make noise. At some point, Toyota issued a TSB and updated these idler pulleys. So it is important that you note the following. The idler pulleys, the original ones, only had the idler pulley, a little washer that sat on top, and then the bolt. The newer style, they had a washer in the back. And the idea that is, that washer in the back seals the bearing of the idler from the back, so you wouldn't have debris, dirt, and rust go inside of it. And now we have problems. So if you're replacing these idlers, they're super common. You'll hear them screeching, and you spin the idler by hand, you'll hear it making the noise. When you replace them, get the updated ones with the washer in the back. So another common thing on these is the water pump. Of course, Toyota has issues with water pumps. This water pump on this one is not really difficult to replace, and you'll just see coolant running down from it. It is not as common on the later ones than the early ones, but nonetheless, it is something I would keep an eye on. If all of a sudden you have coolant disappearing, you look at the water pump as your first source of leaks. The second coolant issue is head gaskets. These are less common. As these trucks age, we're starting to see a few cases. Usually your telltale sign is misfires when the truck is cold, and it'll run really rough, and then all of a sudden it's smooth out and everything is good. Some of them get to a point where they're continuous misfire. You replace the coil, replace the injector, check everything seems fine. It's actually a head gasket leaking. And that's unfortunate, and the reason for it is still unknown at this point, potentially from bad maintenance. We've also seen cases where the head gasket leaks externally, and usually the head gasket just rusts out from road salt, and you'll see coolant on the side of the cylinder head, and rust is the word we're going to use for this truck. You'll see the theme with rust with this truck. And speaking of the head gaskets, this is not really specific to this truck. It does happen on this truck, but it also happens on other Toyota models. The knock sensors, they are a little bit of a bear to get to because there's a little bypass tube that goes in the middle, and you have to remove that. In order to remove that, you need to remove one of the cylinder heads. That's just the way they designed it. So if you ever have issues with knock sensors, you could get the knock sensors replaced, but I highly recommend, consider that as a point. Pull the heads out, do head gaskets, put it all back together. Don't do one side because the instructions will tell you to remove one side, and that's all you need to pull that pipe. But do both sides. Do not cut corners here. You'll actually do many things in one shot. you'll fix the potential head gasket issue, you replace the knock sensors, and you have to reseal the front cover. So consider that as a mid-life refresh of the car, where you resolve multiple common problems in one shot and life is good. And last but not least, and this is more the earlier ones, maybe 2003 and 4, maybe some 5s, but mostly 2003 and 4. The radiator leaks, and you'll see at the bottom of the radiator, it's all covered with coolant and leaking. Some people will say it's because the radiator hangs a little low and gets hit by rocks, but it's also well covered, and I don't see that. It just happens from age, and it's something that we've seen a lot. So keep an eye on those radiators on a regular basis, especially if they're original. And as of the date of filming this video, this is an older truck now, so keep an eye on those radiators and coolant level. Let's talk about the V8 engine. Now, for lack of a better word, this is my favorite engine Toyota makes. It is literally bulletproof. You're not going to have really much issues with this big gas guzzling Humber giant iron block engine. However, there are a few things that are attached to it that could be of an issue. First one being, this is a timing belt engine. Every 90,000 miles, you're going to want to replace the timing belt, and they can be a bare DIY, but they're not really that difficult once you've done one. The other thing is exhaust manifolds, and especially the rusty ones. Remember, rust is a theme with this truck, and the less rusty truck you can get, the better. The exhaust manifolds start rattling in the morning, and they develop cracks, and some of them actually flat rot out from rust. They start rattling in the morning, like they make a clatter noise in the morning, and then it'll go away as things expand and crack. But eventually, it's going to get to a point where it'll always make that noise, and you start smelling the fumes inside the cabin, and that's not good. So they are a bear to replace, of course, and they're very expensive, both labor and parts. But that's one thing with these. If you're going to buy a V8 one, make sure you start it when it's cold and listen to that clattering noise that they make when they're cold. The other thing with this engine, this is more the later ones, the secondary air injection had problems. The main source of the problem is the pump. The pump has a small filter. That filter, which is basically a little piece of foam, I don't know why it's there, it doesn't really filter much, but that's how they designed it. That little foam comes apart and goes everywhere. It clogs all the valves, clogs everything, and they are a nightmare to replace because the valve sits all the way behind the intake manifold, and it's really difficult to get to it. So that's one thing. Do not buy one with secondary air injection codes, because it's very difficult and very expensive to repair that system. One more thing with this engine, which is not really a common issue per se. Every car at some point will lose its starter, and that's just the way it is with cars. The starter in the V8s is conveniently located underneath the intake manifold. Not a great spot, very difficult to replace, especially DIY, but just heads up. It's underneath the intake manifold, and when they go, it's going to get expensive, especially if you're paying someone to do it. Now, other than these few issues, the V8 is solid. I mean, the thing has no problems. I mean, the biggest leak you're going to get from this engine, pushing it, is a valve cover gasket leak, which is super simple and super DIY to do. All the maintenance is simple. Timing belts a little bit difficult. Spark plugs are a joke. They're right there. They're super simple. Basically, you're doing 2 4-cylinder engines. And one thing on spark plugs, and this goes back to the V6, on the V8, they're iridium spark plugs every 120,000 miles. On the V6, they're non-iridium plugs every 30,000 miles. Now, you're more than welcome to put iridium in the V6 and call it a day, but that's the plug Toyota decided to go with. So every 30,000 on the original plugs for the V6 4Runners. Let's talk about the transmissions. Now, I don't recall the last time I've seen this generation 4Runner in the shop with a transmission problem. However, there are a few things that you need to know about it. Overall, there are 2 transmissions for this generation. There's a 4-speed and the 5-speed. They're both really ancient, and they're both bulletproof for the most part, as long as you replace the fluid every 60,000 or 6 years, especially if you tow or do off-roading, which this thing is, of course, super capable of that. We'll talk about the 4-wheel drive system in a little bit. The other thing that you need to be aware of, they did have some issues, just like the newer generation 4Runner, with the park neutral safety switch. They get corroded, they start throwing codes, and eventually a truck doesn't want to go in park or doesn't want to come out of park. That's as simple as replacing the switch. Sometimes it's because these are a little older, the switch will be a little corroded. Not really the end of the world. It's not really a very expensive thing to do. And that's about it with the transmission. One thing I will warn you about with these. Some folks will decide, I want to do a transmission filter, which they do have a filter, which you don't really have to replace if you service the transmission fluid on time. However, when you go to replace that filter, you're going to open a small can of worms, because these are also notorious for the bolts for the transmission oil pan to break. That's very common, and be ready, because they have a lot of thread lock from the factory. When you take them out, especially if you sprinkle in a little winter goodness salt, they're going to seize up. Seen so many of those show up leaking because half the bolts are missing. Somebody tried to remove them and didn't have enough. They ran out of skills to drill them and retap them. They're very difficult because they're aluminum. And just don't open that can of worms if you don't have to. Take my word, trust me, I've seen these go 300,000–400,000 miles on the original filter. Just replace that fluid on time and you're good to go. So the four-wheel drive system on these trucks, and of course that's the highlight of this truck, because that's what makes these things super capable off-road. Let's talk about a few things with that four-wheel drive system that you need to be aware of. First one is not really the four-wheel drive system, the CV boots. I don't remember the last 4Runner that came in the shop that didn't have one or both of the CV boots in the front leaking. Unless, of course, if it's not leaking, then it's been fixed 2 months ago. That's just something with these trucks. They leak all the time. And please do me, and more importantly yourself, a small favor. Don't replace the axle with an aftermarket one. The Toyota ones are extremely expensive, overpriced if you ask me, but you can replace the CV boots. You catch this on time, replace the CV boots. They're semi-DIY, I suppose. You can do that. It's a messy job, but it's not really difficult to replace them. You can do it yourself. Buy the CV boot kit from the dealership. It's not really that expensive. Replace them, and now you're good for a while until they start leaking again, which I guarantee you it will happen. That's just the way it is. The clamps they used were not the best, and if you use aftermarket ones, it still doesn't work, and they'll always leak, and that's just the way they are with these trucks. But they'll last a few years. I mean, we're not talking every 2 months you're going to do them, but they're not going to last 20 years, which we're used to with the other stuff on this truck. The other thing with the four-wheel drive system, it's not really a problem with the design or the system itself or the components. It's more the use. Some folks will drive these trucks for 10 years and never use four-wheel drive. Then they go use it that one time and it'll get stuck and seized. Make sure you practice that four-wheel drive. Every month, every 2 months, put it in a four-wheel drive, cycle through everything, make sure all these actuators are moving and free. Life is good, even if you don't drive it in snow and rain. And I understand you can't put them in four-wheel drive and drive pavement, but you can do that on a straight road just for a little bit, then shut it, then go out back into two-wheel drive. That rehearses everything and keeps things moving so they won't seize. Typical stuff that seizes on this: the actuator on the transfer case, the ADD actuator, which is in the front differential. That's what locks the front wheels to drive in four-wheel drive. Make sure you rehearse that, and you'll actually never have issues with these. Other than this issue, I don't really see any other issues. Rear end is solid. There's not really much issues with them. One thing on the rear end, since we're talking about it, it is not very common, but I will bring it up to your attention because I've seen a few cases. The axle seal will eventually, from age, especially if you look at the older spectrum of these, will start leaking at some point. And a very simple place to look at it is right on the back of the backing plate. Make sure there's no oil standing there. If you see that, get that axle seal replaced, because eventually it's going to go inside. Basically, it'd ruin your parking brake. And we don't want to do that. If you can catch that in time, just replace the seal, life's good. Let's talk about the chassis stuff. So the X-Reus suspension. To keep a long conversation short, if you have struts and shocks that have a hydraulic line, you have X-Reus. Don't really see the difference between the non-X-Reus or with X-Reus trucks, but these are a little bit better than the newer generation 4Runner, which they leak, every other one leaks. But still, when they do leak, you have to replace the cross. So if your left front shock leaks, you have to replace that, the line, the middle shock, and the right rear shock as well. X-Reus, they're crossed. But here's a recommendation. These things can get pretty expensive, and if you have an X-Reus truck and one of the shocks start leaking, you have issues, just dump the whole system. Buy two struts, 2 shocks in the back from a non-X-Reus, and you're not going to really see any difference other than you won't have to spend a small fortune replacing all these components. Another thing with chassis is noise over bumps. Every 4Runner that comes into shop for noise over bumps needs front sway bar bushings. You go tug on the arm to see if the bushings are loose. They don't feel loose, but then you'll start replacing the whole suspension and everything is still, you have a very loud knocking noise over bumps. Sway bar bushings in the front. Very common on these, and if you have a rusty one, what's also common with that as an added bonus for the saltness, the bolts break inside the frame. It's difficult, you got to drill them out or punch it and put a nut in the back. That is just what we deal with when you have salt on the road in the winter. However, if you have knocking noise from the front, the first thing you're going to do is replace the $20 bushings, and you're going to see that most of the time, that's it. That's all it needed. Otherwise, suspension in this thing is pretty solid. Of course, as they age and add miles, ball joints will eventually go at some point, but not something chronic and common. Well, what is chronic and common is the wheel bearings in the front. They're very notorious to go, and they usually get so bad where the wheel starts moving. So periodically inspect them for movement. You're going to hold the wheel, move it this way, make sure they're not loose, because some of them will get loose and not make noise like the roaring noise you hear from bearings. Let's talk about the brakes on this truck. So it has 4-piston caliper brakes in the front and just single piston caliper brake in the back. The backs don't really have many issues, except with rust, they seize up, but there's nothing chronic with the design. The fronts, however, especially if you live in the Rust Belt, where I am, I'm from Chicago, and this is the norm here, they're notorious to seize up and pulsate, and almost every older 4Runner that's not been taken care of that I drive, you drive it, you push the brake, the truck goes one way or another, because you have a locked up caliper. That is very common on these, and when you do brakes, there's a very high chance you're going to end up needing calipers, or at least rebuild the caliper to clean everything up and make sure it's moving. So that is something you want to watch for. And the key thing is, like, if you're going to buy one or you own one and you're wondering, wait, how do I know I don't want to take everything apart? Just drive it, stomp on the brake really hard, and feel the steering wheel. It'll just jump one side or the other. That's how you know there's a problem with the calipers. The other thing with these, and this is somewhat common, but not as common as the other stuff, is the ABS actuator failure. And what actually fails in that big behemoth of a unit is the motor. I have heard that there are some outside third-party vendors that sell you the motor only and you can DIY replace it. I don't know of any to recommend to you, but research this before you go spend thousands to replace that whole unit, or get a used one for also a lot of money to put it on, and then 2 months later that goes because that also has a bad motor. That's just the way with these, and this is one you're going to have to deal with. And lastly, about brakes, this is a salt belt special. The brake lines on this truck are all coated except 2 common lines that are notorious to rust and leak and cause issues. There is the line that goes from the front calipers to the hose. That line is notorious to break and get rusty and leak, and especially when you do brakes, you move the caliper and it just snaps. So if you see it rusty on your next brake replacement, consider replacing that little line. They're super inexpensive from the dealership and very simple to replace. Just replace it while you're at it. And the other one that is common to leak, which is also not very difficult to replace and not expensive at all, is the one on the rear differential, the lines that go across the rear differential, and they rust and leak. So make sure if you're replacing them, coat them yourself, or if yours are good, consider putting undercoating on them so you can protect them. Let's move on to the body issues, and we have a total of 2 things here that you need to be aware of. One of them is the back door handle. Now, the back door in itself has a few things. We'll talk more about that when we go to the electrical stuff, but the handle itself, they are notorious for the handle to have, like the rubber on the handle to get this strange texture. I don't know if they get burned, if they get a chemical reaction. It just shrinks and it shrivels, and then you can't open the back door anymore. You have to really push it hard to open. This is very common on these, very simple to replace, not really something difficult or expensive. But if you start having problems with the handle is the rubber on it. Actually, if you cut the rubber and expose the button, you can actually open it, but then you have, you know, elements, water getting inside. So that's something that was common on these. The other thing is the sunroof. Especially this is more of an early 4Runner special. Pre-facelift, they seem to have gotten a little bit better as 06 and up, but still possible with the newer ones. The sunroof sticks. You open it, it jams and starts making a rattling noise, and there was actually a TSB on this, and the TSB called for a replacement of the whole sunroof with a redesigned one. But here's a trick for you. If you know, at this age, and at this age of this truck, if you have a 2003 4Runner, you're not going to spend a few grand on a sunroof replacement because the sunroof got stuck open. It's actually the visor that gets stuck. Something with the visor mechanism that makes the glass part stick. So here's a trick to get these closed. If you ever find yourself in a situation where it's open and it doesn't want to close, you can actually pull on the visor down, then close the sunroof, as you see here. Simple process, dangerous, so be careful. Maybe use a little coat hanger to pull that visor down and then close it. But if you ever find yourself in that situation, at least you can get it closed, disconnect the motor, and so you wouldn't accidentally open it, because it'll open but it won't close until you get it taken care of, or just pretend you don't have a sunroof anymore, because trust me, these things get pretty expensive when you want to replace them. Electrical stuff. I have to remind myself that these trucks have electrical systems, because overall they're super reliable electrical wise. They don't have many issues. Very minor things that we're going to talk about here. The first thing is, I don't remember the last 4Runner that the AC control panel had all working lights. They're notorious to go, and you see them at night or out. It's not really a big deal, and it's really very simple to replace the bulbs, but it is something that is very common and chronic with these, that the bulbs go only for the AC control panel, nothing else, and that little screen on the dash as well. The other thing is the back door. The back door has a little computer that controls the wiper, the awesome back window that rolls down. That computer has some issues. And another thing is, again, we go back to the rust special. Some of these will collect so much salt inside the door that the tracks for that back window will rot, and that will cause all kinds of problems. If you have issues with the back door not opening, the window's not opening, the rear wiper's not working, look at that computer, because that could be the issue. And there was at some point an updated computer for these. Now, if you are from California, Texas, Arizona, or any of the states that don't destroy their cars in the winter, you will have some pity on us, the ones that live in the areas with salt, because we're going to have the frame conversation. Folks, unfortunately, the frame is the biggest Achilles heel of this truck. If you live in an area like me, Chicago, where salt is used in the winter, the salt will destroy the frame. It will rot it out, and you'll have holes everywhere, and it's actually a safety concern. Unfortunately, Toyota did not really address this like some of the Tacomas and Tundras and Sequoias. This one was left alone. So if you are buying one, do not buy a rusty one. The first thing you're going to do when you're buying one is inspect the frame. If it has even a slight hint of rust or it's not undercoated, walk away. It's not worth it. Most people will keep these trucks for 20, 30 years, except the ones that have rust, because then you have holes in the frame and things start falling off the frame basically, and that's not good. And this is one of the biggest Achilles heels of these trucks, like the one behind me. This is a pristine, well-maintained truck, and you can see how nice it looks on video, but unfortunately this one behind me actually has holes in the frames, and it's starting to get really bad, and the owner has voiced concern over it, and he flat out said, this is the only reason I would get rid of this truck if the frame like collapses in half, which I honestly haven't seen one collapse in half, but it's only a matter of time, because these things rust really bad. And if you buy one from a non-rust area and it's pristine and clean, and you move to a rust area, undercoating is a must on these, because the frame will rot and it'll end your ownership of this truck. And you notice that most of these problems are related to rust. So majority of these problems you're not going to have simply by not living in an area with salt. Just thought I'd bring this up because the frame doesn't have issues other than rust. So what are the best years to buy these trucks? I almost want to tell you all of them. 2003 to 2009. However, I see a significant improvement in the facelifted model, 2006 and up. If I was shopping as of the date of filming this video for the awesome 4Runner behind me, I would look for 2006 and up. Not because the 2003 to 5 is not good, but because there is enough improvement in the new one to make it worth it. You're not buying one new. At this point, there's no new trucks like this one. So I would consider the later ones. If you're buying an early one, make sure you check the common issues because most of them were more common in the first 3 years than the later ones. And the most important thing, it doesn't matter what year you're buying, the frame and the rust is the most important thing. Trust me, I have seen so many people come in the dealership that they just bought a very low mile 4Runner. They're very happy, then we lift it up, it's all rotten and it needs so much work, it's not even worth fixing. So make sure you watch the rust situation because otherwise this thing will run for 30 years without an issue, 300, 400, 500,000 miles without breaking a sweat. So there you have it, folks. These are some of the common issues that I see with these trucks working in a dealership full-time as a Toyota Master Diagnostic Technician. I hope you learned something new. If you own a 4Runner or you're shopping for one, I hope this video gives you a better insight on what to look for, what to expect, and what to keep an eye on. If you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day. Another thing is, I forgot what the other thing is, so let me go check my computer real quick and see.